January 1944. High above the frozen fields of western Germany, the winter sky stretched wide and pale, a cold, empty dome broken only by the distant hum of engines. At nearly 25,000 feet, a single American aircraft moved across the sky. It looked exposed, alone, far from the protective formations that normally filled these skies with dozens of bombers and escort fighters. On German radar stations along the Rhine, the signal appeared small, but clear. Within minutes, Luftwaffe airfields roared to life. Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s climbed rapidly into the thin air, their pilots confident. A lone American aircraft this deep inside German territory was a rare opportunity, the kind of easy interception every fighter pilot hoped for. From the cockpit of one German fighter, the American plane was already visible, a dark silhouette against the pale winter clouds. The pilot pushed the throttle forward. The hunt had begun. What the German pilots did not realize was that the lonely aircraft ahead of them was never meant to escape. It was meant to be chased. By the beginning of 1944, the skies over Europe had become one of the most fiercely contested battlefields of the entire war. What had begun in 1939 as scattered reconnaissance flights and small bomber raids had evolved into an industrial-scale air war. Thousands of aircraft now crossed the continent every week. Factories, railways, oil fields, and cities had become targets. And above them, pilots fought a daily struggle for control of the air, for the United States Army Air Forces. The strategy was clear. American planners believed that precision daylight bombing could cripple Germany's war machine. Unlike the British Royal Air Force, which often bombed cities at night, the Americans flew large formations during the day, aiming for specific industrial targets, ball-bearing factories, aircraft plants, oil refineries, and transportation hubs. The backbone of this strategy was the heavy bomber. Aircraft like the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator were designed to fly high, fly far, and defend themselves. Each bomber carried multiple machine guns, forming what American planners believed was a nearly impenetrable wall of defensive fire. When dozens, sometimes hundreds, of these bombers flew together in tight formation, their gun turrets overlapped. Any attacking fighter would have to fly directly into a storm of bullets. In theory, the system made the bombers nearly untouchable. But the reality of the war proved far more dangerous. By 1943, the Luftwaffe had developed highly effective tactics to attack these formations. German fighter units learned to approach the bombers from specific angles, often diving at high speed through the formation and firing powerful cannons at close range. Many German aircraft carried 20 mm or even 30 mm cannon shells, capable of tearing through a bomber's aluminum skin with devastating force. A single well-placed burst could destroy an engine, shatter a wing, or ignite a fuel tank. Even the heavily armed Flying Fortress had limits. The problem became painfully clear during several major missions in 1943. One of the most famous occurred in October of that year during the second raid on the German city of Schweinfurt, a key center for ball-bearing production. Hundreds of American bombers flew deep into Germany without long-range fighter protection. The Luftwaffe responded with wave after wave of interceptors. German fighters attacked relentlessly, sometimes firing rockets into the bomber formations before closing in with cannons. By the time the surviving aircraft returned to England, the losses were staggering. Dozens of bombers had been destroyed. Many others limped back riddled with holes. Hundreds of airmen were killed, wounded, or captured. The mission demonstrated a harsh reality. Heavy bombers, no matter how well armed, could not safely operate deep inside Germany without fighter escort. For the United States Army Air Forces, the solution required a new kind of aircraft, one capable of flying long distances alongside the bombers and defending them from interceptors. Escort fighters already existed, but they faced a serious limitation: range. Most fighters of the early war period could not travel far enough to accompany bombers all the way to their targets inside Germany. Aircraft like the P-47 Thunderbolt were powerful and durable, but their fuel capacity limited how long they could remain over enemy territory. For much of 1943, American bombers often flew the most dangerous part of their missions alone. German fighters knew this. Luftwaffe pilots would sometimes wait until the escort fighters turned back toward England. Only then would they launch their attacks, catching the bombers at their most vulnerable moment. But by late 1943 and early 1944, the balance in the air began to shift. New developments in aircraft design and escort tactics started to change the nature of the air war. Long-range fighters equipped with drop tanks could now fly much deeper into occupied Europe. For the first time, American escorts could remain with the bombers nearly all the way to their targets, and as American fighter groups gained experience, they began experimenting with something even more aggressive than simple escort duty, instead of merely defending the bombers. They started hunting. Fighter pilots were increasingly given freedom to roam ahead of the bomber formations, searching for German aircraft before they could even reach the bombers. This shift transformed the skies over Europe into a far more complex battlefield, one where deception, positioning, and timing could decide the outcome of an engagement before the first shots were even fired. And in this evolving war above the clouds, some American squadrons began experimenting with tactics designed not just to fight the enemy but to lure them into a trap. A tactic that would soon unfold high above occupied Europe when a single American aircraft appeared alone in the sky, inviting German fighters to chase what seemed like an easy kill, and somewhere beyond the clouds, unseen and silent, something else was waiting. While food shortages tightened their grip across much of Europe, the United States entered the war with a very different advantage. Agriculture. By the early 1940s, American farms were among the most productive in the world. Mechanized equipment had transformed farming over the previous 2 decades. Tractors replaced horses. Combines harvested grain at unprecedented speed. Refrigerated rail cars and trucks carried meat, milk, and produce across thousands of miles. When the United States entered the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, this vast agricultural system quickly shifted toward military needs. American planners understood that feeding millions of soldiers would require more than simply shipping bread and fresh meat overseas. Armies fighting across deserts, jungles, mountains, and frozen plains needed food that could survive long journeys and harsh conditions. The responsibility for solving this problem fell largely to the United States Army Quartermaster Corps. Scientists, nutritionists, and military planners began designing rations that were compact, durable, and capable of sustaining soldiers in combat. These meals had to be light enough to carry in a pack, yet contain enough calories to fuel men engaged in physically exhausting operations. One of the most important developments was the creation of the K-ration, introduced in 1942. The K-ration was designed as a short-term combat ration for troops on the move. Each soldier received 3 small box meals per day: breakfast, dinner, and supper. Inside were items carefully selected for both nutrition and durability. A typical K-ration could contain canned meat, biscuits or crackers, processed cheese, powdered drink mix, sugar tablets, chewing gum, cigarettes, and 1 small chocolate bar designed to withstand heat. The chocolate itself had been developed with the help of the Hershey Company, which produced a specially formulated bar for military use. Unlike ordinary candy, it was intentionally dense and less sweet, so it would not melt easily in tropical climates. Alongside the K-ration, the U.S. military also relied heavily on the C-ration, a canned meal designed for longer-term use. Each C-ration consisted of metal tins containing items such as beef stew, meat and beans, pork and beans, or meat and vegetables. While soldiers sometimes complained about the repetitive menu, the rations provided reliable calories and protein. More importantly, they could be transported across oceans, deserts, and battlefields without spoiling. The United States was not only feeding its own military. Through programs like Lend-Lease, American food shipments supported Allied forces around the world, from Britain to the Soviet Union. Millions of tons of canned meat, flour, powdered milk, and other supplies crossed the Atlantic aboard convoys protected from German submarines. Food production factories expanded rapidly. Canneries worked day and night sealing vegetables and meats into steel containers. Bakeries produced millions of loaves of bread. Refrigerated warehouses stored vast quantities of butter, cheese, and frozen foods. By 1944, American farms and factories were producing such enormous quantities that the United States was able to supply soldiers fighting across multiple continents simultaneously. And in an unusual twist of wartime logistics, that abundance would soon affect the lives of captured enemy soldiers as well. During the war, the United States held an enormous number of Axis prisoners. After Allied victories in North Africa and Europe, captured soldiers were transported across the Atlantic and housed in camps scattered throughout the American countryside. In total, more than 425,000 Axis prisoners of war were held inside the United States. Most were Germans. Many others were Italians captured during campaigns in North Africa or following Italy's surrender in 1943. The treatment of these prisoners was governed by international law, particularly the Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, 1929. Under the convention, prisoners were required to receive food comparable in quality and quantity to that provided to the soldiers guarding them. For American camp administrators, this rule created a unique situation. The United States Army already had a massive system designed to feed millions of troops. Extending similar rations to prisoners of war was not difficult. So inside hundreds of POW camps spread across states like Texas, Arizona, Iowa, and Oklahoma, Axis prisoners found themselves receiving meals prepared from the same supply chains feeding the American military. For many of them, the experience was completely unexpected. Some arrived believing that captivity would mean hunger. Instead, they stepped into a country where bread was still white, meat was still plentiful, and chocolate was common enough to be included in a soldier's daily ration. And for prisoners who had spent years hearing propaganda about American weakness and excess, the first meal inside those camps would challenge everything they thought they knew about the enemy. For many Axis soldiers, captivity in the United States began with a moment of quiet disbelief. After long journeys across the Atlantic in guarded transport ships, newly captured prisoners were delivered to camps scattered across the American interior. Many arrived exhausted, uncertain of what awaited them. Most expected harsh conditions. In the wartime imagination of many German and Italian soldiers, prison camps were places of deprivation. Years of propaganda and battlefield rumors had shaped their expectations. Food would be scarce, guards would be hostile, life would be reduced to survival. Instead, the first thing many prisoners encountered was the smell of cooking inside American camps. Kitchens operated on regular schedules. Large dining halls served meals 3 times a day. Bread was baked fresh in many facilities. Vegetables were prepared in bulk. Meat was distributed in portions that, while modest by American standards, often exceeded what prisoners had been receiving on the front lines. For some prisoners, the difference was immediate and startling. German soldiers captured in North Africa in 1943 had often spent months living on limited rations. Supply lines across the desert had been fragile, vulnerable to air attacks and long transport distances. By the time they reached captivity, many were underfed. When these men entered American camps, their first trays sometimes included white bread, canned meat, potatoes, and coffee. For soldiers accustomed to darker wartime bread or substitute beverages, these meals felt almost luxurious. Italian prisoners often experienced an even greater contrast. By the later stages of the war, Italian military rations had deteriorated significantly. Many soldiers captured during the Allied advance in Sicily and mainland Italy had been living on small portions of pasta, bread, and whatever vegetables were available locally. Inside American camps, their diets suddenly included protein-rich foods that had become rare in their homeland. Fresh fruit occasionally appeared, milk was available in some camps, even chocolate, a rare treat in much of wartime Europe, sometimes appeared in ration packages. The experience produced mixed emotions. Some prisoners felt relief. Others felt embarrassment. A few remained suspicious, convinced the generous meals must have some hidden purpose. But over time, as days turned into weeks, a quiet realization spread among many of them. Captivity in America did not resemble the desperate shortages they had left behind. And that realization raised uncomfortable questions about the balance of power in the war. Behind those meals stood one of the most powerful logistical systems ever assembled. Feeding millions of soldiers across multiple continents required enormous coordination. The American military relied on a complex network of farms, factories, railroads, ships, warehouses, and distribution centers. Food began its journey in the agricultural regions of the United States. Across states like Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, and Illinois, farmers harvested vast quantities of corn, wheat, soybeans, and livestock. Mechanization allowed a relatively small agricultural workforce to produce enormous output. These raw products then moved into processing facilities. Canneries sealed vegetables and meats into airtight containers designed for long-term storage. Flour mills converted wheat into the base ingredient for bread and baked goods. Dairy plants produced powdered milk and butter that could travel long distances without spoiling. From there, the food entered military supply networks. Railroads carried shipments to coastal ports and inland bases. Convoys of cargo ships transported supplies across the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. In Europe and North Africa, trucks and trains distributed rations to frontline units. The scale was staggering. By 1944, the United States was shipping millions of tons of food overseas every year. American soldiers fighting in France, Italy, and the Pacific depended on this constant flow of supplies. Yet even with such global demands, the system still produced enough to sustain the large population of Axis prisoners held within the United States. POW camps were integrated into the same logistical network that fed American troops. Food shipments arrived regularly. Storage facilities preserved surplus supplies. Kitchens prepared standardized meals according to military nutritional guidelines. The result was something that surprised many observers. While much of Europe struggled with rationing and shortages, prisoners inside American camps often received diets that were stable, predictable, and nutritionally adequate. In some cases, former prisoners later reported gaining weight during their captivity. It was an outcome few Axis soldiers could have imagined when they first entered the war. Food carries meaning beyond simple survival. For soldiers who had spent years immersed in wartime propaganda, the experience of American abundance created a subtle but powerful psychological effect. Nazi propaganda had frequently portrayed the United States as a nation of soft civilians and undisciplined soldiers, wealthy, perhaps, but lacking the toughness required for serious warfare. Yet the logistical system visible inside POW camps suggested something different. The ability to feed millions of soldiers across oceans, while still providing adequate meals to prisoners, hinted at a deeper strength. Industrial capacity. Agricultural productivity. Transportation networks capable of moving resources on a massive scale. For prisoners who had seen shortages spreading across Germany and Italy, the contrast could be unsettling. Some began writing letters home describing the surprising conditions of captivity. Others discussed the differences quietly among themselves inside barracks and work details. The war, they realized, might not simply be a contest of armies. It might also be a contest of economies. And as prisoners continued to observe the steady flow of food arriving at their camps, that realization slowly began to reshape how many of them understood the conflict they had been fighting. But the deeper contrast would become even clearer when they compared their new diets with the rations still being issued to Axis soldiers on the battlefields of Europe. While many Axis prisoners in the United States were discovering steady meals and occasional luxuries, soldiers still fighting for Germany and its allies were facing a very different reality. As the war dragged into its later years, the Axis supply system began to strain under immense pressure. Germany's early victories had temporarily expanded access to food resources across occupied Europe. Grain from Poland, livestock from France, and agricultural output from other territories helped sustain the German war effort during the first years of the conflict. But the situation began to change dramatically after 1942. The enormous scale of the Eastern Front consumed resources at a staggering rate. Millions of German troops required daily supplies of food, fuel, ammunition, and winter equipment. Rail lines stretched across vast distances, often damaged by partisan attacks or overwhelmed by sheer volume. As the Soviet counteroffensives pushed German forces backward, supply routes grew longer and more fragile. Frontline soldiers began receiving smaller portions or less varied food. Bread sometimes arrived stale after long transport journeys. Fresh meat became rare in many sectors. Soldiers often relied heavily on preserved foods such as canned meat, dried vegetables, and hard bread known as Kommissbrot. In extreme conditions, especially during harsh winters on the Eastern Front, soldiers sometimes slaughtered horses that had collapsed from exhaustion to supplement their rations. Italian forces experienced even greater difficulties. The Italian economy struggled to maintain steady food production during the war. Agricultural output declined as manpower shifted to military service and transportation networks deteriorated under Allied bombing. Italian military rations frequently lacked sufficient calories for soldiers engaged in intense combat operations. Bread and pasta remained staple foods. But protein sources such as meat were limited. As Allied forces invaded Sicily in 1943 and advanced into mainland Italy, logistical disruptions made the situation worse. Many Italian units found themselves short of supplies, relying on local food sources or irregular deliveries. By comparison, the stable and predictable meals inside American POW camps highlighted a growing imbalance between the industrial power of the Allies and the strained economies of the Axis powers. For many prisoners, the contrast between expectation and reality carried an additional dimension. Before capture, most Axis soldiers had been exposed to years of wartime propaganda. In Germany, the regime of Adolf Hitler maintained strict control over newspapers, radio broadcasts, and films. The propaganda ministry led by Joseph Goebbels portrayed the enemy in carefully crafted ways. The United States was often depicted as a society driven by consumerism and luxury. According to these portrayals, American soldiers relied on machines and mass production rather than discipline or endurance. The implication was clear: such a nation might possess wealth, but it lacked the determination required for prolonged war. Yet inside POW camps, prisoners encountered evidence that contradicted this narrative. American guards and administrators followed structured routines. Camp operations ran according to detailed regulations. Food arrived regularly, delivered through an efficient supply system that rarely faltered. Meals were not extravagant, but they were consistent. Breakfast might include bread, oatmeal, or eggs. Lunch and dinner often featured meat, vegetables, and additional bread. Coffee or milk accompanied many meals. For prisoners accustomed to shortages or substitute foods in Europe, the availability of these items suggested a country with deep reserves of agricultural and industrial strength. Over time, this quiet contradiction chipped away at earlier assumptions. The war they had imagined, one in which Germany and its allies faced weaker, less disciplined enemies, began to look different when viewed through the everyday reality of camp life. And food, simple as it seemed, became one of the clearest signs of that difference. Historians of the Second World War often emphasized dramatic battles and military technologies. Tanks rolling across open fields, aircraft dueling in the skies, warships clashing across vast oceans. Yet behind every one of these operations stood an invisible requirement: supply. No army could fight without fuel, ammunition, equipment, and above all, food. The Allied powers gradually developed an overwhelming advantage in this area. The United States in particular possessed an economic base capable of producing extraordinary quantities of agricultural goods. American farms generated grain, meat, dairy products, and vegetables in volumes far beyond the nation's domestic needs. Industrial food processing extended the lifespan of these products, allowing them to be stored and transported across the globe. This abundance allowed the Allies to sustain long campaigns in distant theaters of war. Soldiers fighting in Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific could rely on relatively stable ration systems despite the enormous logistical challenges involved. By contrast, the Axis powers faced structural limitations. Germany lacked sufficient farmland to feed its population and military independently. Italy struggled with weaker industrial and agricultural infrastructure. Japan faced severe shortages as Allied naval power gradually cut off access to imported food supplies. Over time, these differences accumulated. An army that is well-fed fights longer, moves farther, and recovers faster from exhaustion and illness. An army facing shortages must conserve energy, adapt to reduced supplies, and struggle with declining morale. Inside American POW camps, captured Axis soldiers were witnessing this contrast in one of its simplest forms: the meals placed in front of them each day. What began as a moment of curiosity, the opening of a crate containing unfamiliar rations, slowly revealed something much larger. The war was not only being fought with weapons. It was also being fought with farms, factories, and supply ships. And soon, events would bring that realization into even sharper focus. For many Axis prisoners held in the United States, the true realization of American abundance did not come all at once. It emerged slowly, through routine. Morning meals. Evening trays carried across wooden tables inside camp dining halls. Day after day, the pattern remained the same. Bread appeared reliably. Meat was served in regular portions. Coffee was available. Vegetables arrived in steady supply. Sometimes fruit appeared as well. Apples, peaches, or canned varieties preserved months earlier in American factories. For prisoners who had expected the scarcity common across wartime Europe, the consistency itself became surprising. The food did not run out. Supplies arrived by truck on schedule, unloaded into camp storage rooms and kitchens. Cooks prepared meals according to standardized menus designed to meet nutritional requirements set by the United States Army Quartermaster Corps. These meals were not designed to be luxurious. They were meant to sustain soldiers, but to prisoners who had experienced years of rationing and uncertainty, the difference was unmistakable. Inside camps, such as Camp Hearn in Texas, German prisoners ate in large mess halls under the watch of American guards. Bread was baked in camp bakeries, often using flour supplied through the same agricultural networks feeding the U.S. military. At Camp Algona in Iowa, prisoners helped prepare meals in kitchens that produced thousands of portions each day. Some prisoners were assigned work duties that included assisting with food preparation, giving them direct access to the supply stores that kept the camp running. Elsewhere, in the desert environment of Camp Florence in Arizona, prisoners lived under the intense heat of the American Southwest. Yet, even in this remote location, shipments of food continued to arrive regularly by rail and truck. For the prisoners, these deliveries became a quiet demonstration of the scale of American resources. The camps themselves were temporary structures, rows of wooden barracks surrounded by fences and guard towers, but the system supplying them stretched across an entire continent. Flour from Midwestern farms, canned meat from processing plants, vegetables harvested in multiple states, all of it moving through warehouses, rail networks, and supply depots before reaching camps scattered across the American landscape. Many prisoners had never imagined such logistical capacity. Before capture, their understanding of the United States had been shaped largely by propaganda and limited wartime information. The country was distant, almost abstract. Now they were living inside it. And what they saw suggested something very different from the image they had been given. Meals were prepared with an efficiency that reflected industrial organization rather than improvisation. Kitchens followed strict schedules. Food stocks were monitored and replenished before shortages could occur. For some prisoners, the realization came through comparison with letters from home. Families in Germany often wrote about growing difficulties obtaining meat, butter, and sugar. Civilian ration cards limited access to basic foods. Long lines outside shops had become common in many cities. Yet inside the camps, those same items sometimes appeared regularly: a slice of white bread, a portion of canned beef, a small bar of chocolate included with certain rations. Even the bread itself carried symbolic weight. During the war, German bread frequently included fillers or substitutes to stretch limited grain supplies. In American camps, however, bread was typically baked from refined flour that produced the soft, pale loaves common in the United States. To some prisoners, this small difference spoke volumes. It suggested a country where grain supplies were abundant enough to avoid the compromises imposed by wartime scarcity elsewhere. Over time, prisoners began discussing these observations quietly among themselves. The war, they realized, might be shaped by forces larger than battlefield courage or tactical skill. Behind the fighting stood factories, farms, and transportation systems operating on a scale few had imagined before arriving in America. And with every meal served inside those camps, that reality became harder to ignore. But the full significance of what they were witnessing would become clearer only as the war moved toward its final years, and the gap between Axis shortages and Allied abundance grew impossible to hide. By 1944, the war had entered a decisive phase across Europe. The Axis powers were beginning to feel the full weight of Allied industrial strength. Air raids struck factories and rail networks inside Germany. Naval blockades tightened around occupied territories. On the Eastern Front, massive Soviet offensives pushed German forces steadily westward. Inside the United States, however, daily life, even within prisoner-of-war camps, continued with a sense of stability that contrasted sharply with the chaos unfolding overseas. For the Axis prisoners held there, the difference became increasingly clear as news from Europe slowly filtered through letters, rumors, and occasional official announcements. Families wrote about growing shortages, bread rations shrinking, butter disappearing from shops. Coffee replaced entirely by substitutes. German civilians, like soldiers at the front, were feeling the effects of a war economy stretched beyond its limits. Yet inside the camps scattered across the American countryside, meals continued to arrive with predictable regularity. Bread baked in camp kitchens, canned meats delivered in bulk shipments, vegetables preserved in industrial canneries. Months earlier, sometimes even small luxuries, chocolate, fruit, or sweetened drinks, appeared in ration distributions. For prisoners who had once mocked American field rations as processed and artificial, these items now carried a different meaning. They were proof that the United States possessed something the Axis powers increasingly lacked: vast reserves of productive capacity. Factories continued running, farms continued harvesting, railroads continued delivering supplies across enormous distances. The scale of the system became visible in subtle ways. Supply trucks arriving at the gates of POW camps rarely appeared half-empty. Storage buildings remained stocked with flour, canned goods, and preserved foods. Kitchens prepared meals without the constant adjustments required by shortages. Even waste became a telling detail. In several camps, prisoners noticed that leftover food was sometimes discarded or used for livestock rather than carefully rationed. For men accustomed to wartime scarcity, the sight of uneaten bread or meat being thrown away could feel almost surreal. The message was impossible to ignore. America was not merely feeding its own soldiers. It was feeding armies across multiple continents, and still had enough food to maintain stable diets for hundreds of thousands of captured enemy troops. This realization did not arrive as a dramatic revelation. Instead, it settled slowly into conversations between prisoners sitting on barrack steps or standing in mess hall lines. The war might already be decided, not because of a single battle or general, but because of the enormous industrial machine operating far from the front lines. An army that never runs out of food can continue fighting indefinitely. An army facing shortages must constantly adapt, conserve, and endure. By the final years of the war, that imbalance was becoming increasingly visible across Europe. German soldiers retreating across the continent often received reduced rations as supply lines collapsed under Allied pressure. Transportation networks damaged by bombing made deliveries irregular. Civilians competed with the military for dwindling food supplies. Meanwhile, the Allied advance carried with it an almost continuous stream of logistical support. Cargo ships crossed the Atlantic in steady convoys. Rail networks in liberated areas quickly restored supply routes. Mobile bakeries, field kitchens, and ration depots followed advancing armies across France and into Germany itself. Inside American POW camps, the prisoners could not see the battles unfolding thousands of miles away. But they could see the supply trucks arriving at the gates. They could taste the bread placed on their trays. They could open ration packages containing chocolate produced by American factories still operating at full capacity. And through these simple details, a quiet understanding emerged. The war was not only being fought with tanks, aircraft, and artillery. It was being won by production lines, farms, and supply chains that stretched across an entire continent. And by the time many prisoners fully grasped that reality, the outcome of the conflict was already beginning to take shape. When the war in Europe finally ended in May 1945 with the German instrument of surrender, celebrations erupted across much of the Allied world. Cities in the United States, Britain, and other Allied nations filled with crowds, marking the end of nearly 6 years of global conflict. But for millions of people across Europe, victory or defeat did not immediately bring relief from hardship. The continent had been devastated. Transportation networks lay in ruins. Rail lines were twisted by bombing raids. Bridges had been destroyed during retreating battles. Entire industrial districts in cities like Berlin and Hamburg had been reduced to fields of rubble after years of Allied air attacks. Agriculture had suffered as well. Farm machinery was scarce. Fuel for tractors was limited. Many farm workers had spent years in military service or had been displaced by the fighting. Fields across parts of Eastern and Central Europe had been damaged by trenches, artillery fire, and abandoned equipment. Food production fell sharply in the immediate post-war years. In Germany especially, civilians faced a harsh reality. The collapse of the Nazi government and the destruction of much of the country's infrastructure created severe logistical problems. Delivering food from farms to cities became difficult when rail lines and roads were damaged. Rationing remained strict. Bread, meat, butter, and sugar were distributed through controlled systems that often provided only minimal daily calories. Long lines formed outside bakeries and distribution centers as civilians waited for limited supplies. For many returning German prisoners of war, the contrast with their time in American captivity was striking. After months or years spent inside camps in the United States, where meals had been stable and predictable, they now stepped back into a homeland struggling to feed its population. Some former prisoners later wrote in memoirs or interviews that the most regular meals they had received during the war occurred while they were prisoners in America. The statement was not meant to praise captivity. Rather, it reflected the enormous difference between the industrial capacity of the United States and the devastation that war had brought to much of Europe. In Italy, the situation was also difficult. The country had experienced both invasion and civil conflict after the collapse of the fascist regime in 1943. Infrastructure damage and disrupted agriculture left many regions facing serious shortages during the final years of the war and the period immediately afterward. Markets were unpredictable. Prices for basic foods rose rapidly. In some cities, black markets became one of the few ways civilians could obtain additional supplies. Across Europe, governments struggled to rebuild transportation systems and restore agricultural production. But recovery would take time. Millions of people still relied on ration systems well into the late 1940s. For families who had endured years of wartime scarcity, the memory of stable food supplies remained distant. For the former prisoners who had spent part of the war inside American camps, however, those memories were vivid. They remembered the mess halls, the bread baked fresh each morning, the occasional chocolate bars included with rations, and the steady arrival of supply trucks that never seemed to stop. What they had witnessed inside those camps now appeared in a different light. It had not simply been generosity or policy. It had been a glimpse of the enormous economic strength that had helped bring the war to its end. But the story of food in the aftermath of the war did not stop with Europe's devastation. In the years that followed, the same agricultural power that had fed Allied armies and even enemy prisoners would play a central role in rebuilding the continent itself.